While wolves usually travel in packs, the werewolf is a loner. Unlike a normal wolf who avoids humans, the werewolf will attack any human he comes across. Pointed ears, hair on palms, large claws, paws, eyebrows that are connected over the bridge of the nose, or hair between the shoulder blades are common werewolf features. A silver bullet is the only sure way to kill a werewolf, and after it is shot, its head must be cut off and burned, the ashes scattered in the wind. If a werewolf is killed in his human shape, he will revert to his animal shape at death. But the task is dangerous, for being bitten by a werewolf will turn any human into a werewolf. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that what we consider to be key and pivotal parts of the werewolf mythology owe a majority of their legacy to Kurt Siodmak, the man who wrote the original screenplay for The Wolfman, which is the subject of today's episode of Monster Clash. Representing the old, we have the 1941 classic starring Lon Chaney Jr., Representing the new, we have the 2010 remake starring Benicio del Toro under the title of The Wolfman. Apparently Universal thought condensing Wolfman into one word would make it easy to differentiate the two, but try telling that to Google. While I may get a lot of flack for saying this, The Wolfman is not what I would call the strongest entry in the Universal monster movie franchise. This was at the point when the studio started relegating horror films to B-picture status, and it really shows with how this film was made. Throughout the film, we're given a few primary locations, that being Talbot Hall, the town, and the forest that both serves as the location of the gypsy camp and the site of various werewolf attacks. And while the film does a good job of making those locations presentable, the short runtime doesn't really allow for any of the scenery to sink in. In the case of the 2010 remake, you can immediately identify what advantages they had in terms of technology and what locations they had access to, as they had large-scale sets that can easily communicate the secluded nature of Blackmore, England. However, the film is not without its fair share of problems. I mean, for a film shot in color, it's not really colorful. I mean, everything feels kind of dulled or washed out, a la Saving Private Ryan, and they do try to make the film visually interesting with a few eerie lighting effects, but there's not really enough contrast to make anything really stand out. All I kept remembering was a bunch of grays, a bunch of blues, and a bunch of dark blacks. It's basically too dull and washed out and too dark. Both films have good points and bad points in how their worlds are set up, but in regards to atmosphere, I'm going to give it to the 1941 version. Again, although they had the technological and locational advantages in the 2010 remake, the images in the 1941 version are at the very least more interesting to look at, because you can tell that the people who were working on this were thinking in terms of a color film, whereas with black and white cinema, a lot of what created depth and what created visually appealing images relied heavily on lighting, and really, the images in the 1941 version are just more interesting to look at. The stories of both films offer redeeming qualities all around, but they're not without their fair share of problems. A lot of it boils down to fairly formulaic writing. Both films are identical in the sense that they tell the story of a lord returning to their ancestral home upon their brother's death. They both feature tragic love interests and very wary townsfolk. However, the 1941 version falls into the same sort of traps that plagued a lot of films during the post-World War II era, partially because of the looming mandates of the Production Code of America. And really, this leads to a lot of formulaic beats that almost feel kind of forced, particularly the romance, because, well, the romance felt forced, and a lot of the overall mystery and mystique of the entire story doesn't really get a lot of screen time. I mean, a lot of it is just almost phoned in. It's like, okay, we have this scene where this happens, we have this scene where this happens. It feels almost factory-made, which makes sense, because this was back during the days of the studio system. That's not to say the film is not without its really good moments. My favorite moments in particular when Larry first faces the werewolf at the beginning of the film, when Larry has his nervous breakdown when he realizes that he's going to turn into a werewolf, and that last exchange between Larry and his father, where his father is pretty much saying, "This is all in your mind and I'm going to prove it to you, so I'm chaining you to this chair," prior to the final scenes of the film. Those are the best scenes, at least in my opinion, throughout the entire movie. When it comes to the 2010 version, it's definitely an update on the original storyline, as well as incorporating some ideas that Siodmak had in the original screenplay that weren't put into the film for various reasons regarding the production code, as well as Universal not willing to front the money to shoot them. Namely the scenes where Lawrence is incarcerated in an asylum and his eventual escape. And another key difference is that this film definitely offers us a more in-depth exploration of the main character's psyche. It shows us how his traumatic past, that being witnessing his mother's suicide and the death of his brother, could have left his mind unhinged, and how the curse has made it so much worse. Like I said, both films have good things and bad things about how their stories are presented. However, I'm going to give this round to the 2010 version. The reason for this is that it allowed things to sink in a little bit more, and narrowing its focus on the main character allowed for a lot more drama throughout the entire runtime, and so it definitely allowed us to more easily empathize with the character. If only they had a better actor. Sorry, Benicio del Toro fans, but there's a difference between sullen and not emoting at all. Unlike last week, we're not going to be doing a Deadliest Warrior comparison between the two Wolfmen because they pretty much have the same exact abilities and weaknesses. I mean, they're both essentially Wolfmen. They basically run around, kill people with claws and biting, and can both be killed by silver. So really what is going to decide this round is not so much the Wolfmen themselves, but two major scenes that are important for any werewolf story: the transformation and the first reveal. In the case of the 1941 version, we never actually see the main character transform into the Wolfman on screen. Most we see is that he checks his arms and his torso where the wound is to see if there's any sign of transformation, leading him to check his legs where he finds out there's more hair. And then the camera stays on his legs as we see the classic fade in, add more makeup effect that they did back then to communicate the fact that he's transforming, which is a tad slow. Continuing that motif, however, they kind of keep the camera on his legs as he's walking through the forest, cutting briefly to his potential victim, being, well, an unknown gravekeeper, and then tilting up to reveal the full makeup in its classic glory. The 2010 version opts for a more direct and visceral interpretation of the Wolfman's transformation. We see Del Toro's body and bones contort and twist into the wolf-like features. As such, it makes the whole experience look a hell of a lot more painful than it did in the 1941 version. In the terms of the first reveal, there's actually a great deal of build-up as you see the townsfolk setting traps and getting people together with their guns and everything to make sure that they're ready to catch this raving lunatic who's going around killing the townspeople. This then leads us to the first reveal, sort of, where we see the Wolfman through a first-person view running through the forest and then essentially springing a trap that the hunters had set out for him, complete with the moose, elk, whatever animal that is. Goes for the elk, falls down the pits, kills a few of the hunters, and it's in those pits with the harsh lighting of the moon shining behind him that the Wolfman is revealed in full. I also like the fact that while the transformation was done in CGI, the fully transformed Wolfman was done with makeup and practical effects. You see that, people? That is how you do an homage to a classic movie monster. That is how you do it. Not the full CGI bullcrap that we got in Van Helsing. So which film had the better transformation and first reveal? The 1941 is a classic and really stands the test of time, but much of its strength comes from what we're not shown as an audience. We only see him partially transform once. We only see his legs, but the second transformation in the film is done off-screen after Larry's father had restrained him back at Talbot Hall. The 2010's transformation is definitely one that inspires fear. It builds upon what was established in the original films and gives it a much-needed update that pretty much gives us a more painful and therefore more terrifying version of the werewolf curse. I mean, with one it's like, oh yeah, it's sitting still and you slowly transform, whereas that one's just like, oh god, your bones are getting twisted every which way. Which one would be the one you would least like to have to go through on a nightly basis? For these reasons, I'm giving this round to the 2010 version. It's just a lot more fast-paced and a lot more terrifying, and does a really good job of building up the kind of destruction that lies ahead for our characters. The original is a classic and has its place in history, but it's not without its flaws from a writing and filmmaking perspective. While the remake is equally flawed, it's definitely one of the better horror remakes that actually is more of a send-up to the original and builds a lot on the original ideas without getting too convoluted and complex or losing the focus of the story. I feel that if Universal took pieces from the 1941 version and the 2010 remake and gave it to the right director who would hopefully choose some better actors, then we would definitely get a werewolf story that would both succeed as a horror film and as a character piece, because the werewolf mythos has a lot of pieces to it that really resonate with audiences. For now, this battle comes to a close in favor of the 2010 version of The Wolfman, the superior film. This has been Monster Clash. Join me next week where we'll hop back across the pond and witness the blending of fact and fiction in a cozy little suburb. On top of that, we'll also get to see a Time Lord. But for now, good night.